Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Chris Moore. I'm the Dean of Sargent College. It's my great honor and privilege to introduce this year's Meredith E. Drench Lecturer. But before doing so, I think it's important that I tell you a bit about where this lecture came from, the person that we have to thank for this very important and great privilege that we have this evening. The late Meredith E. Drench, PhD and physical therapist, established this lectureship as Sargent College's first lectureship, first endowed lecture series, to share and to propagate her passion and belief in the compassionate rehabilitation, her words, of the whole person. Mary, as she was known to her many friends, worked well beyond the fields of physical rehabilitation and psychosocial behavioral sciences. Her efforts represented the very best of patient-centered care and interprofessional practice, even before patient-centered outcomes had such an important part in healthcare. Dr. Drench was a remarkable force in healthcare. In her 1998 book, Red Ribbons Are Not Enough, Health Givers' Stories About AIDS, she tackled some of the most challenging and sensitive issues involving HIV/AIDS, presenting a comprehensive view of this monumental health crisis during a period when our national response was still emerging. It's a remarkable piece of work, well ahead of its time in many ways. So I hope you'll take a moment during the next 45 minutes to reflect on and appreciate the work of today's honoree as it reflects on Dr. Drench's vision for this lecture, appreciating how this event captures and memorializes her highest ambitions for Sargent. And I should mention that Mary's brother, Peter Drench, is here with us today. And this is our one chance to say thank you to the Drench family. Of course, Mary's not with us, but thank you, Peter. And now it's my very great honor and privilege and pleasure to introduce this year's Drench lecturer, Donald M. Berwick, MD and Master of Public Policy. Dr. Berwick is President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, IHI, which he co-founded and led for 18 years. After getting his earliest start as a golf caddy, he went on to serve from July 2010 to December 2011 as President Obama's appointee as Administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. He's authored four books, including the very influential contribution, Escape Fire, Designs for the Future of Healthcare, and he has served on the faculties of Harvard Medical School and the Harvard School of Public Health. He's an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, and many of us will recall his run for governor of Massachusetts in 2014, which was driven by his position for single-payer healthcare and an end to child poverty. His numerous awards include the 2007 William B. Graham Prize for Health Services Research and the 2007 Heinz Award for Public Policy. In 2005, he was appointed Honorary Knight Commander of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II. He's co-authored over 160 scientific articles and 6 books. I hope you'll stick around afterward for a reception in the Sedderberg Lounge, which is just right up on the second floor. And join me now in welcoming this year's honored Meredith E. Drench Lecturer, Dr. Donald Berwick.
Thank you very much, Dean Moore, and thank you all for the chance to be with you, and my thanks to the Drench family, and it's a great honor to be able to speak in the name of Dr. Drench. I got to give you a warning about this talk. It has a little peculiar part to it that you'll know when you come to it, and it's probably not customary in academic environments, but when you get there, you'll see it, and then hopefully you'll forgive me, so I'm giving you a warning in advance. I want to say one other thing. I readily accepted this invitation, not just because of the honoree, but because I have deep respect for the healthcare workforce as an entire workforce, and I think the kind of contribution this college makes to building out the workforce for the future we need and to help young people find their niche in a very broad and wonderful field, healthcare, is a really important contribution. So what you do here, I just want to say what you do here is really, really important. My son-in-law grew up in Zimbabwe, And so he has told me that the Shona people of Zimbabwe have a traditional way to greet each other. The greeting is Marara Se, and that means, did you sleep well? And the traditional response, which they take very seriously, is Ndarara Kana Mararawe, which means, I slept well if you slept well. You'll see that's kind of the keynote to my talk, and park that away, we'll get back to it. This talk is dedicated to two people, Sir Michael Marmot and Alan Kurdi. These two people never met, and now they cannot meet because Alan Kurdi died, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Alan Kurdi later on. But Michael Marmot is very much alive. Michael is one of the leading epidemiologists of our era. Michael directs the Institute of Health Equity at the University of College London, and I hope, Dean, you might have him here sometime. He's quite an amazing man. Michael's been working on health inequalities for 40 years. That's his passion. You can actually skip the whole rest of my talk and just go out and enjoy this sunny day, because all you have to do is buy Michael's 2015 book, The Health Gap. It's the most important book I think I've read in a decade. So go ahead. You can even get online right now and buy it if you want. I won't be offended. Actually, honestly, the rest of my talk is mostly plagiarizing Marmot's book, as you will see. In The Health Gap, Michael introduces us to an unfortunate 15-year-old boy, an imaginary boy, and he calls him Andy. And Andy's pretty normal, but his future is worrisome, and that is because, you see, Andy wants to live as long as he possibly can, but he drew a short straw because of where he lives. Because of where he lives, the chances that this 15-year-old boy will see his 60th birthday are lower than in 49 other countries. If Andy lived in Sweden, he'd have over a 93% chance of living to age 60, but Andy's chances are 6 points lower than that, 49th in the world, 87%. That's lower than in Costa Rica, or in Cuba, or in Slovenia. Andy's short straw is this. He was born in the United States. In 2013, the National Academy of Sciences issued a report which compared our health in the United States to health in 17 other developed countries. Life expectancy at birth, chances of living to age 50 or 60, death rates from 24 diseases or more. We don't look very good in comparison to these 17 countries. In fact, that's putting it awful. That's putting it mildly. We look awful. We're 17th out of 17 on all the outcomes that really matter. For 40 years, Michael Marmot's been trying to find out why. Why does the burden of disease vary so much, even among countries that seem ostensibly very similar? Why does it vary among populations within the same nation, or even in the same city? Why, in the year 2002, when you got on a bus in Glasgow, Scotland, and you traveled west to east for just 3 miles, did the life expectancy fall by 28 years? In the west of Glasgow, you would live 82 years on average. In the east, you would live 54 years on the average. Glasgow may be the worst case for what people in epidemiology sometimes call a subway map or a bus map. It's a view of health status, but it's not worse by that much. This is London's subway map. If you travel 10 miles from Oxford Circus to Star Lane in East London, the life expectancy drops by 21 years. In Flint, Michigan, from one side of the city to the other, it's a 15-year difference in life expectancy. My friend and colleague, Ben Collins, from the King's Fund in London, where I'm a senior fellow, he's written a phenomenal report on Montefiore Health System in the Bronx, in New York City. And I want to read you Ben's words. I'll tell you first, that's your second assignment. Your first assignment is to read Michael Marmot's book. Your second is to get online and read this wonderful report from Ben Collins. Ben writes, every day in New York City, the D train running from Coney Island to the Bronx achieves an astonishing process of social segregation. If you pick up the train in Midtown Manhattan, as the train crosses 85th Street or under 85th Street running alongside Central Park, the residents of the Upper East Side above you have an average household income of $180,000 a year. Smoking, obesity, chronic disease rates are all substantially below the national average. Life expectancy is 85 years. That's better even than in Japan. By the time you cross 165th Street in the South Bronx, the heart of the Bronx, almost all of the white people and all of the suited professionals have exited the train. The average household income has shriveled from $180,000 a year to just $45,000 a year. Unemployment has doubled in the South Bronx. 65% of the kids are born into poverty. From 85th Street to 185th Street, life expectancy drops by 6 months for every minute on the subway, by 2.3 years for every mile that you travel. How big a difference is that? In his book, Marmot does a back-of-the-envelope calculation that's kind of interesting. He says, well, how many years of life would we gain on the planet if by magic we eliminated heart disease tomorrow? Didn't treat heart disease, we eliminated heart disease, it went away. And the answer is humanity would gain 4 years of life expectancy. The gap on the D train is 2.5 times bigger than eliminating all of heart disease. The gap in Glasgow is 7 times bigger than eliminating all of heart disease. Aren't you happy about the miracles of modern medicine? I am. Children live today who would have died in my early years of training with leukemia or congenital heart disease. I'm proud of it. Let's take a look at one of those miracles, statins. Statins are controversial. They may or may not delay or prevent some cardiac deaths, but they're obviously widely used. If you look in the literature and you take the most favorable study of statins, the result is like this. For people who are on statins, the average gain in lifespan is 1 day of life for every year of treatment. It's 20 days of life for 20 years of treatment. When you travel on the D train, that amount of lifespan evaporates in 7 seconds. On the Glasgow bus, you lose 20 days of lifespan every 43 feet. It's a little different from that. It's not a ramp, it's a cliff. But on average, traveling from those 3.5 miles in Glasgow, that's the loss. The statin effect every 43 feet. What is going on here? Is this poverty? Well, poverty is, of course, a killer. You know that. Grinding poverty, dollar-a-day poverty that we suffer from, billions of us suffer from around the world. From the richest countries to the poorest countries in the world today, life expectancy falls by 35 years. In 2015, life expectancy was 84 years in Japan. It was 50 years in Sierra Leone. But that doesn't explain the Glasgow effect or the South Bronx difference. They don't have dollar-a-day poverty. Something else is going on. Michael Marmot is a scholar. He starts with the data. He starts with inference. He doesn't start with political polemics. And in his work, like many of his colleagues around the world, he unlayers the causes like an archaeologist digs a site, layer by layer, with a toothpick and a tiny brush. It takes Michael his whole book to summarize what the evidence says. I'll put it in a nutshell, and then you have to go by the book, remember? So let me go over Marmot's summary. And I must say, he's not alone. There are other scholars I could have drawn on, but he's the one I chose to introduce you to. Marmot played a very big role in his early career in 2 famous studies in England. They're called the Whitehall studies. Maybe you've read about them. Whitehall refers to the seat of government in England, the buildings in London where national civil servants work, all the way from security guards and janitors and clerks to middle-level managers to executives, deputy ministers, the minister, Secretary of State himself, all the way up to the highest officials in the big wood-paneled offices. So what the Whitehall study did was enroll 30,000 civil servants in a longitudinal study over decades, and it tracked their risk factors and their outcomes. Marmot and his colleagues found in the Whitehall study what he calls a social gradient for outcome. Basically, the lower your job grade is in Whitehall, the higher your rate of disease is and the earlier your death. And interestingly, this gradient operates all along the whole spectrum of social status, from the very lowest job grade to the very highest job grade. No matter where you are in the social hierarchy, you are better off than the people just below you, and you're worse off than the people just above you. Even more curiously, the Whitehall study looked at the usual risk factors, cholesterol, obesity, blood pressure, and so on. Everyone expected that this was the cause of the differences in outcome, the risk factors. They are a bit, but they're not even close to the full explanation. They explain a third of the difference. 2/3 of the difference is something else going on, determining the length of life and the well-being of these people. What is it? Well, the glib answer is my topic. It's social determinants of health. What exactly does that mean? Like, what determinants of what health? Whose health? How does it work? And answering those questions has been Michael Marmot's project for 4 decades, along with scholars like him around the world. Now, one thing is for sure, if you haven't already gotten the message, the social determinants of health are big monsters compared to what we throw at them with health care. Healthcare has done miracles, as I said, AIDS treatment, organ transplants, cancer therapies, they're amazing. But whatever is at work in East Glasgow or in the South Bronx is much, much more powerful. Remember, it's 20 years on a statin versus 43 feet on a bus line. The gap can be closed. In Nepal, for example, between 1980 and 2012, life expectancy rose by 20 years. That's 2/3 of a year gained for every year since 1980. 16 hours of life expectancy gained for every 24 hours that have passed since 1980. That's not bad. The health status can be affected. So that's maybe the good news. We have bad news and good news. The bad news is the massive gradients in health are all around us, within our country, within our city, among our neighborhoods. Treating illness is important. Don't believe I believe anything but that, but nothing you can do with treatment can change those gradients, nothing. You could spend the rest of your life, spend all of our money on health care, and you will not produce health. You cannot, you can't. This is not a health care problem. The good news is that health care can change. Now the question is, well, how would that work? So scientists like Marmot have been hunting for decades for the causes of the Whitehall effect, lower status, lower health. And they've come to some pretty strong conclusions, and Marmot categorizes them into 6 categories of causes. He calls them the causes of the causes. So when you say social determinants of health, that's what you ought to mean. This isn't politics yet. It's science. So I'm going to warn you that it's all going to cycle back to inequity, to inequality. It's uncomfortably true. Marmot's language is this: inequities in power, money, and resources give rise to inequities in the conditions of daily life, which in turn lead to inequities in health. That isn't politics, that's science. If you want to improve health, you have to reduce inequity. And we're going to come back to that. But let's first take a closer look at the dynamics, what really matters. So Marmot's first category is early childhood. It matters. Marmot writes, what happens to children in their early years has a profound effect on their life chances, and hence on their health as adults. One measure, as I hope most of you know, of what happens to children is an index. It's called Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs. ACEs were first described at Kaiser Permanente by Felitti and his colleagues at CDC. A child's ACEs score, Adverse Childhood Experiences score, is basically a count. It's just the number of yes answers a kid can give to a list of stressors, stressors like fear of physical or psychological abuse. Witnessing violence is a stressor. Exposure to alcoholism or drug abuse in the home is a stressor. There are 10 or so of those. The predictive value of even a very slightly elevated ACEs score on adult health is astonishing. People with 4 or more exposures as children have 5 times the risk of depression, 12 times the risk of attempting suicide. They're 15 times more likely to have a learning disability. When they get to be adults, they're more than twice as likely to have severe cardiac disease and even more lung disease. They're 5 times more likely to engage in substance abuse. Among nations, the US ranks very poorly on these factors, on childhood well-being. In fact, for many kids, American society is an ACE factory. UNICEF reviewed childhood well-being, material, educational behaviors, and risks in 21 countries in the US in 2013, and the US ranked last. If you invest in kids, the health of the population improves. This could be done with social policy. This is hard to see, but what you're seeing here is a look at redistributional policies in 35 countries, showing how childhood poverty decreases in response to public policies on income transfers. The US ranks worst in childhood poverty, except for Romania. I think perhaps you're beginning to hear a theme. One of the interesting countries that I track a lot is Scotland. Scotland is very different. There, the National Health Service has begun a program initially called the Early Years Collaborative, now called the Children and Young People Improvement Collaborative, and it aims to break the cycle that gives you the Glasgow map. What they're doing is focusing on making Scotland the best place in the world to grow up. And the National Health Service in Scotland is working with the municipalities of the country to bring new sense of agency, new possibilities to families in every single municipality in the city, in this country. They recently had a project focusing just on stillbirths in Scotland. They reduced it by 20% in 3 years. Marmot's second factor is education, especially education of girls and women. Educational attainment correlates really strongly with infant mortality rates and with total life expectancy. These are the data for the US in 2008. Between the lowest and highest education, a 10-year difference in length of life. Of course, this is a correlation, as you know from your statistics courses. It's not a cause. Could it be that poor health leads to poor education instead of the other way around? Well, I guess it could be, but that's not what's going on. Education improves health at any income level, and preschool education is particularly powerful. This is a rather complicated diagram, but let me bring you into these weeds for a minute. This is a complicated chart, and it shows how the amount of education you get relates to life expectancy in 15 countries. Each bar is a country, and the open circle at the top is the life expectancy for the highest quintile of education, and the dot at the bottom is the life expectancy for the lowest quintile of education. So what you see in some countries, for example, Estonia and Hungary, this matters a ton. 15 years of life difference between the upper and lowest quintile. But notice that a number of countries, like Portugal and Finland and Sweden, they've virtually eliminated the disparity. In other words, they've taken away the relationship between education and life expectancy. Your life expectancy is high no matter what your educational level is. And that's because inequity really, really matters. Those countries invest in reducing inequity that in other countries are associated with better or worse education. The third variable in Marmot's book is the conditions of work. Some of that may be obvious, like, for example, levels of pay. Marmot uses an interesting term. He introduced it to me. I wasn't aware of it before. It's called a minimum income for healthy living. We're used to seeing minimum wages. But this is a term invented by Marmot's mentor, UK epidemiologist Jerry Morris. Morris defined a minimum income for healthy living as it includes not just what is necessary for food and shelter, but what is required to live a life of dignity and to take one's place in society. Imagine a policy environment which aimed not at a minimum wage, but at a minimum income for healthy living, engagement in society. Deny an elderly woman enough money to buy a gift for her grandchild, or to take a bus to a social gathering, and you will harm her health. She will die sooner. In the U.S. and elsewhere, the income and wealth inequalities have soared now to the point where there are a lot of people in our country, hardworking people, who just cannot afford the minimum income for healthy living, cannot afford the things that give them dignity and meaning in their lives. Other properties of work matter as well. It's not just your level of pay. Toxins, for example, and exposures matter, that's for sure. So does, importantly, a sense of control over your work, a sense of agencies, a social isolation at work versus a sense of being treated fairly. Unemployment kills. In one study in the Czech Republic, Poland, and Russia, after 6 years, unemployment doubled the death rate in men and women. And we now know that loneliness is a killer as well. This is a study at UCL. People who were socially isolated at the start had double the risk of developing coronary heart disease compared to those who weren't. And that leads us to Marmot's fourth category of things that matter in health outcomes, and that is the way the society deals with aging. How a society deals with and cares for its elder population doesn't just affect the elders, it actually affects the whole community. One thing that helps is to give elders a chance to stay in employment, in useful work, longer. Marmot blows away the myth that if you keep older people at work, you deny opportunities to young entrants. That's not what the data show. In general, the higher the participation of older people in the labor market, the higher is the employment rate for everybody, including the young. The whole theme here is the theme of empowerment. It's not just about elders or about work. It's about giving people a chance to be active and to stay connected, a chance to participate in society. A meta-analysis of 148 studies of people over age 64 found that on an average of 7.5 years of follow-up, people who were socially engaged had a 50% lower chance of dying, and physical activity protects against cognitive decline. You may know the data that the life expectancy in this country, which has risen steadily but slowly, has now for the past 2 years for the first time gone down for adults in the middle years. The deepest understanding of this change has come from the Nobelist economist Angus Deaton, the demographer, who has coined the term deaths of despair. And he finds that the relationships between those mortality changes and deaths of despair, which are deaths associated with substance abuse, with suicide, with alcohol, explain a substantial amount of that decline in life expectancy. And you see it now in the opioid epidemic, now killing 70,000 people last year in our country. Engagement in society and a sense of equity is fundamental to interception of the dynamics of deaths of despair. Marmot uses the term resilience of communities as his fifth factor. The evidence is very strong that if you give local communities, places, a chance to control things, they come up with very powerful approaches to changing the factors that affect health and well-being. This term, place-based thinking, place-based care, I've heard a lot in the UK, not much here yet, but it's this focus on the importance of communities that feel self-efficacy, that feel powerful. Those communities have better health. There's an interesting study by Professor Chris Lalande from British Columbia. He studied suicide rates in indigenous communities, natives in Native Canadians in Canada, where suicide rates are phenomenally high. However, Lalande wrote that communities that hold on to their cultural history and promote their own collective future have far lower suicide rates than communities that feel significantly disempowered. The opposite of these aspects of these assets is social exclusion, and you already showed you the effect of exclusion on life expectancy. So here's Marmot's description of what he means by community resilience. What happens at the local level can contribute to crime, to alcohol-related deaths, obesity, road traffic injuries, depression, health problems linked to the pollution of air and water, problems with housing, the dynamics of communities that are not working. On the plus side, the local level can improve health through a high level of social cohesion, social participation, security and low fear of crime, active transport, provision of green space, walkability, availability of healthy food and good services. Powerful determinants. So that's Marmot's list so far. If you want health, then you have to work on the causes of the causes, early childhood experiences and supports. education, especially for women and girls, the conditions of work, which include pay and security and employment, but also meaning and respect and a sense of agency and personal control, the experiences of aging, especially the fighting loneliness and isolation, and the resilience of communities, especially with respect to local control in these factors. But Marmot's not done. He adds a sixth item to his list. He calls it fairness, fair societies. Since inequity matters so much, he cannot escape the question, and he doesn't try to escape the question, what, after all, would lead us to invest in the reduction of inequity? After all, some countries do, and some countries don't. And in general, we don't. In the countries that reduce inequity, people live longer. This is a really stark question as I studied this work. It's a question really about our image of ourselves, the kind of community we want, the kind of nation you want, the kind of world you want. It's a test of honesty, which is, do we care about each other or not? If a man from Mars showed up, he might have some questions about this. I actually have an extraordinary news flash for you. Right here, right now, in this room, the AV technicians have told me that we have, for the first time in human history, made contact with a man from Mars. It's quite extraordinary. I'm sure you won't mind if I interrupt my lecture to make this connection. Hello, are you there? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can hear you loud and clear. I don't know why they're laughing. Ignore them. This is pretty exciting. Tell me your name, please, and tell me where you're calling from.
Yes. I am calling from Inkablatten, which your people call the planet Mars. I am called Justin Bieber, after one of your species.
You know English, and you know about Justin Bieber? That's amazing.
Yes. We love Justin Bieber. In fact, in his honor, I have many of his, how do you say, tattoos. I can disrobe and show them.
No, that won't be necessary. I'm sure your tattoos are very nice. So what would you like?
Well, we have been watching you for quite a long time, and we wanted to say hello.
Well, that's really nice of you. So why have you decided to contact us after such a long time, Mr. Bieber?
Oh, call me Justin. It is because we want to improve our health on Mars, and we thought you might have some suggestions.
Well, we'd be happy to help. Can you tell me more?
I will have to be quick. I'm getting a low battery signal. But briefly, we live here on Mars about 1,000 years, Martian years, which is 1,882.14 of your years. But we have an improvement project. We want to double that. So how are you doing? You got anything for us?
Well, actually, we only live about 75 years on average. We're making some slow improvements.
So how are you trying to improve that?
Well, we build hospitals. We train doctors to treat our diseases. We have lots and lots of machines. We take drugs.
No. You don't understand my question. I am not asking about your repair programs. I'm asking about how you stay healthy.
Well, we put $3 trillion a year into what you're calling repair, Justin. You should see all the cool stuff we have. I mean, we have hospitals and machines and robotic surgery and...
That's nice, but can we talk about health? I mean, how much do you put into health?
Well, I'm actually not really sure.
Well, estimate. Is it like $3 trillion? $10 trillion?
Oh, my goodness, my goodness. No, nothing like that. I mean, where will we find that kind of money, Justin? Maybe on Mars, but not here.
I thought you said that you found $3 trillion to fix things after they are broken. Why would you not keep from breaking them in the first place?
Because it costs too much.
I think we have a bad connection. Did you say it costs too much? Is that like an Earth joke?
No, I'm serious. It does cost too much. And after all, it's not our job. I mean, that means we'd be focusing on housing and schools and transit systems and prisons and income inequality. I mean, we can't do everything. So we really don't have the resources.
So you would rather do repairs? May I please use an English colloquialism? Are you nuts?
No, we're not nuts, Justin. We're just logical. I mean, it's just that it's just.
My battery is getting really low. I think maybe I should get moving along to another planet. I will use a traditional Martian farewell. Upsy dupsy.
Oh, I know. That's like Spock. Live long and prosper. Right?
No. It means get back to me if you get a brain.
Well, no. Look, don't go, Justin. Please tell me something I can use. I mean, how on Earth? I mean, how on Mars do you live to be 1,000 years old?
It is not rocket science, Earthling. We work on causes, not just the consequences. You should try it sometime. Over and out.
What a rude guy. Where does he come off telling us that we're wasting time? Get a brain? I mean, really? Now, where was I? Oh, yeah, social determinants of health. So I guess I was asking a rude question myself, which is, do we mean it or don't we? The pursuit of health. I mean, I want to be clear. If we mean it, when we mean it, when we don't just wave our hands at real social determinants, when we act on social determinants, it does work. That's not a theoretic statement. It's an empiric statement. I want to give you 5 or 6 examples of what it looks like to work on social determinants. Try Eastlake, Georgia. That's a neighborhood in Atlanta. It's one of 22 so far so-called purpose-built communities. This movement, purpose-built communities, was started by a philanthropist, a real estate mogul, a developer named Tom Cousins, who came across a fact that Cousins could not get out of his mind. It was a Rutgers University study which showed that 3 out of every 4 inmates in New York state prisons came from just 8 neighborhoods in New York City, 3 out of 4. He thought that was a horrid form of destiny, that your place is your fate, and he set about to change that. He invented these purpose-built communities. Those places, like Eastlake, Georgia, they're neighborhood-based efforts. Eastlake has 175 acres, 542 apartments, 2,100 students. But with grant support from public and private stakeholders both, they built a stakeholder table with schools, the Housing Authority, the YMCA. They tackled the housing supply, the food supply, food availability, parks, recreation, and health coverage, a comprehensive view of the determinants of health. Eastlake started in 1995, and these are the results. 90% decline in violent crime. Welfare dependence is down from 59% to 5%. Unemployment of the non-disabled, non-elderly is 0. High school graduation rates actually are up. The latest data, they're up from 50% when they started to 97%. They work on housing, economic stability, cradle-to-grave education, public health, medical care, neighborhood and physical conditions, and community bonding and resilience. Working on the social determinants of health works. Take a look at Community Medical Center, medical clinic. It's a free clinic in Kershaw County, South Carolina. They aimed at reducing emergency room visits first by targeting social determinants. They started a school-based health center, 4 satellite clinics and churches. Non-elective ED use fell 25%. They targeted high school graduation rates. Graduation rates are one of the best single predictors of long-term health status. They beefed up mental health services, sports, physical, social supports. They train youth ambassadors on quality improvement methods. And graduation rates are now 94%. They're going to be 84%. They'll be 94% in 2020. There's a particularly interesting enterprise underway around the country right now called anchor institutions. One example is the Cleveland Foundation and Living Cities in Cleveland, Ohio. They've bonded together, the Cleveland Foundation, Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, Case Western. They're transforming their core operations, and the theme is buy local, hire local, and live local. They're changing where hospitals purchase from. They incentivize their employees to live locally, and they hire from that local community. These hospitals need to anchor institutions in the Cleveland area. They've invested over $500 million into the 7 poorest zip codes with the worst health outcomes. They've created 1,800 jobs and leveraged $4 billion of investment in those communities. And they don't do it to the communities, they do it with the communities. What they're doing is using the economic power that healthcare automatically has, is 18% of the GDP, to affect the state of the local community. The approaches explain this, that the anchor mission approach is a commitment to apply economic power in partnership with communities to mutually benefit the long-term well-being of both. For instance, anchor institutions can use their position as major employers and purchasers to improve economic opportunity and well-being in low-income and underserved communities. This is not the healthcare system taking new dollars and putting in the communities. They're taking the current dollars they're using in the supply chain and hiring and using it to affect local communities. And the heft is amazing. From the Anchor Playbook, which I'll show you in a moment, the calculation looks like this. When hospitals and healthcare systems in the United States collectively spend more than $782 billion annually, nearly $1 trillion, they employ 5.6 million people. They hold investment portfolios of $400 billion. The game-changing impact on the health and well-being in America's communities potentially cannot be overestimated. Rush University Medical Center in Chicago is likewise taking the lead. They actually were ahead of this in the anchor institution. They're working on Chicago's west side. Between Chicago Loop and the west side of Chicago, the subway map shows a 16-year difference in life expectancy. They've created this playbook, which I would add to your reading list. It's now Marmot's book, Ben Collins' report from the King's Fund, and read the Rush Anchor Mission Playbook. It is phenomenal. I think it should be required reading for every healthcare board and every executive in the United States healthcare. The tactics are the same as you saw in Cleveland: local hiring, local sourcing, local construction, impact investing in communities, and support for affordable housing. As I said, the gap between the Chicago Loop, where the life expectancy is 85 years, and West Garfield Park, just a couple miles west of there, is 16 years. So they formed an alliance called West Side United with 5 other Chicago area healthcare organizations and other organizations. They now have declared their aim. They're going to cut that life expectancy gap by 50% by 2030. I hope they go faster and bigger. The use of knowledge about the epidemiology of a local environment, what that subway map looks like, is a real asset here, because then you can target your efforts where they count, as they are in West Garfield Park. I go to the UK often, and I visited a health system just a couple months ago in Gloucestershire, England. The National Health Service there is working with a nonprofit called Treasure Seekers to help the 700 residents of that area who have serious mental illness. These people are constantly bouncing in and out of emergency departments and police stations. But together with the health service, they have now run the Cavern. The Cavern is a drop-in center. It's open evenings. It's 365 days a year. It has a coffee bar staffed by the people with the mental illness challenges. They have a music stage and performance area for them. And they have a living room, and they have people from the National Health Service there also as coaches. They've changed the whole profile of that troubled community of people with major mental illness in Gloucestershire. When I visited the Cavern, I met a police officer who told me that people who were in her police station 5 times a day, she now never sees them because they have a home, they have a place to go to. Hospital admissions, ED use have plummeted. I can't help commenting that the single-payer environment helps a lot, because the decline in mental health hospitalizations in the hospital trust in Gloucestershire is not a problem for the mental health trust. They're working with a single unified, single source budget of care for the entire community. They're happy to put the money to treasure seekers in order to empty the bed in the mental health hospital. We looked already at Montefiore Health System. I showed you Ben Collins' report. Montefiore has a 40-year track record of working on this stuff with social determinants in a very stressed part of the city, and it's a big place. It's 32,000 employees. They employ a population, they help a population of 3.5 million people. They work on the causes of causes, and the list is endless. I spent a day at Montefiore just a couple months ago and was just blown away. They use navigators in the emergency departments to anticipate people who are at a high risk of return and reach out to them before they ever leave the emergency room. They use post-discharge calls within 48 hours of discharge to identify people who have a need for help. They have teams in the hospital and in the ED dedicated to housing support. There's a housing team, there's a nutrition team, there's a pharmacy support team. They use, very strongly use high-risk registry, and they have a sense of the heat map of needs in the community, so they know which places are places that are going to need special investment. Montefiore isn't waiting for trouble. They're building every tool they can to anticipate and intercept the trouble. And they do all this in partnership with the community leaders. When I visited Montefiore, the community leaders were in the room with me. My wife's name is Ann. She's an environmental lawyer who used to be chair of the Public Utilities Commission in the state, very interested in environment. Now she's sustainability director for the city of Newton, Massachusetts, where I live. She told me a story about a meeting with her boss, the mayor of Newton, and departmental leaders in Newton. This is the mayor, Ruth Ann Fuller, just come into office. The mayor had spotted an article in the New York Times which is about basically what I'm telling you. It showed evidence that the future of a child was determined by the social conditions of the local neighborhood where he or she grew up, that your place was your fate. And I guess you could say Mayor Fuller had discovered Michael Marmot. And she did something pretty simple. She asked the planning department to draw a map of Newton to show where poverty and social risk were concentrated, and this is Newton's subway map. It's a wealthy city, but unevenly so. And two neighborhoods lit up. You see them there in yellow and green. What Mayor Fuller did at the cabinet meeting that Ann told me about was she took out her laser pointer, she pointed at those two areas, and she said, from now on, whatever you're doing, fixing potholes, planning services, repairing a school, drawing a bus route, whatever you're doing, from now on, she said, start here. And start here is the title I gave to this lecture. That, to me, it's the two-word charter to answering the tough questions that the man from Mars asked. You start here. You start where the causes of causes lie. You start where the plague of inequality and social isolation and racism and its consequences hide and write their tragedies. This is a very big idea. It's not a small idea. It wakes us up with that one deeply uncomfortable question that I asked before, which is who we are and who we wish to be. The question is simply put, are we one? In December, a couple months ago, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights celebrated its 70th birthday. And in Article 1, at the very beginning, it says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Are we one? Do we care? In this vicious, unconscionable time in America, a time when our leaders have the audacity, they have the meanness to divide us and make us fear each other, we have a moral obligation to say no to that meanness. We have an obligation to insist on compassion, on solidarity. We are one or we are lost. This is not just about health, it's about peace, it's about a livable planet, it's about a future for my grandchildren. And so, do you sleep well? I sleep well if you sleep well. I said that I would dedicate this speech to two people, Michael Marmot, who you already met, and Alan Kurdi. You actually know Alan Kurdi. You have seen him. He is this child in what must be one of the most famous photographs of our generation. Alan Kurdi was a 3-year-old Syrian Kurdish refugee whose little boat capsized on his way to freedom and whose body washed ashore on the coast of Turkey. The social determinants of health killed this little boy. Forces of fragmentation and self-interest, of political ambition and economic inequality, neglecting the least among us in the service of what? Of forces that are far, far more powerful than any germ or any gene. That's what killed this kid. Forces way beyond the reach of the medical cathedrals that we have built. Forces that we're going to have to change, and I think now. This death is our death. And you can't see this and sleep well. See, we can walk away. We really can. We can say it's not our job. You can't do everything. I just work here. We give health care. We don't produce health. But if we walk away from this, you make no mistake. There's no honest harbor in the claim that you can't do anything about it. You absolutely can. That would be a lie. Kershaw can and does, Eastlake can and does, Montefiore does, Rush, Gloucestershire, and so did Mayor Fuller with her pointer and her map and her leadership and her instruction. Start here. You can walk away if you really think you have to, I say to healthcare, but if you think it's time, and I think it's time, to get real about the things that tear apart our health and our future, then let me show you what a few start heres would look like for next Tuesday, right after you all finish reading Michael Marmot's book. We can sign up with the IHI's 100 Million Healthier Lives Project. The organization that I'm now senior fellow in has this international project now on achieving population health through action with over 2,000 organizations internationally. I urge you, in whatever position you're in, get on the web, find IHI 100 Million Healthier Lives, and you will be joining Kershaw, and you'll be joining Eastlake, and joining a lot of the examples I showed you. You can contact purpose-built communities, and you can start to lead one. You, in this case, being any institution in the city of Boston, could do this. Healthcare organizations, by the way, have generally been bystanders here. They have not been the hosts, but there are some counterexamples, and we could change that. You could do what Mayor Fuller did. You can create a map of deprivation for the area you serve and then copy what Mayor Fuller did. You can get together with the hospital leaders or organizational leaders, get together with their staffs and their resources, their partners. You aim your laser pointer where the beasts of causation, the causes of the causes hide, and you say, everybody start here. That, I must say, by the way, is a redistributional policy. And countries that make progress on health are unembarrassed, unapologetic for the concept of redistribution as an underlying expression of solidarity. You don't do any of this to the communities, you do it with the communities. We say in the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, drawing on the work of Susan Edgeman-Levitan and Mike Barry and Maureen Bisigliano, in healthcare we need to change the question from what's the matter with you to what matters to you. And the same can apply to work with communities that will benefit from a sense of agency and self-efficacy. We don't produce health for communities. We will only do it with them. You can become an anchor institution. I would plead with Boston's hospitals to do this. Study the method in the Rush Anchor Playbook. Buy local, live local, hire local. Use the presence, our 18% of the gross domestic product, for good, for the support of people that need that extra bit of help. Get the Anchor Playbook and read it. It is supported by something called the Democracy Collaborative, and they have a hospitaltoolskit.org, and if you're a hospital leader here in the room or know one, direct them to it. You can also start with abundance. Developing a knowledge base about what the assets are in a community that can be brought to bear on these problems, which is really what Montefiore does. You start looking for where the resources are that are not used for the pursuit of health. You can get help here. The AuntBertha.com website or Health Leads both have rich bodies of resources in any part of the country where you can look to see what is available. The idea is to move from reaction to prediction and finding ways like Gloucestershire does with the Cavern or Montefiore with its navigators to figure out who will be in trouble and go there first. You can copy Scotland. The Early Years Collaborative and the Children and Youth Collaborative is eminently replicable. In any American city, we have yet to find one. Most of all, I think we have got to listen to Michael Marmot's findings. Inequalities in power, money, and resources give rise to inequities in the conditions of daily life, which in turn lead to inequities in health, the causes of the causes. We cannot achieve health and accept vast inequity. That's a bankrupt notion. It just can't work. That image of little Alan Kurdi haunts me every day. He didn't build that boat. He didn't create the conditions of existence that put him in that little boat. People did. Nature didn't do that. People did it. And what we build, we can change. In response to this argument, too many people, for my taste, say we can't do it here. We're not Sweden, they say. They're blonde, they're socialists, they're tall. They say Americans take too much pride in individuality to show solidarity. I beg to differ. In solidarity, you look at that picture of that 3-year-old boy, and in solidarity, we cry. We are perfectly capable of caring for other people. We're perfectly capable of trusting in our own compassion and acting on compassion. We can be what we choose to be. So, do you sleep well? I sleep well if you sleep well. And just imagine what kind of country or world we would be if that were our greeting universally from now on. I don't know about you, but I reject the demagogues who try to tell us that our fate and our duties are not intertwined. I want to ask those leaders, do you sleep well? I will tell them others cannot sleep well and they need to wake up. We have to be a nation that helps first the least fortunate among us. Health is available no other way. And the causes of the causes are not ours to accept, they are ours to change. So start here. Thank you, Chris. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for your insights and your sharing your thoughts. While I agree that we can do a lot starting from our own individual decisions, the system of healthcare in the United States has some characteristics that were developed over a large number of years and have created a set of incentives that are not in line at the moment with what you're suggesting. So what is your view with respect to how do we change the incentives in the system for those that have the power and to make decisions?
I mean, it's a system of it's a network of causes that keep us from addressing these things. And part of it is the system of the economic system we built in healthcare. We built a healthcare system that depends on its own activity for its survival. Hospitals celebrate a full bed, not an empty one. The machines, we get the machine and keep it whirring because we need what the machine does. None of this, little of it, in my opinion, is venal in its aims. I mean, we can talk about Purdue and you know, rapacious pharmaceuticals if you want. That's bad acting. But most of this acting is well-intentioned, but it's in a context which doesn't encourage focusing on what they do in Gloucestershire and working with treasure seekers. I personally think we're going to have to change our concept of the way we finance and support healthcare, so it gives us an opportunity to work on place-based issues. We don't have that opportunity now. That's why I'm advocating for massive changes in the way we're funding healthcare. But to me, that's not the whole story. It's not even the beginning of the story, because I think individuals can do things. You know, every doctor can ask every patient they see what matters to you. You can change your question tomorrow morning, and you can begin to use whatever resources you've got to orient. If you're a therapist here, and you can do that too. You know, you just change the balance of power. and at the case-by-case individual level start to act like what the person's life circumstances are really does matter. And you will not have all the tools you want, but you have some of them, and I think that would be a change. I do think political leadership matters, and we need, I mean, the English National Health Service did not come from nowhere. It came from courageous post-war political leaders who said, hey, everybody, we're really in this together. And if we want a country that pursues health and well-being, we will have care that is universal, free at the point of care, and supported by general taxation. We can have a set of principles about what, if we know the destination, that we would adhere to. It's all hands on deck, you know, it all matters. I would ask you, even though we don't have the financing system right now that supports fully this kind of investment, Russia's doing it, Montefiore's doing it, Kaiser Permanente's doing it. So, you know, there are ways with proper corporate executive leadership that we can reorient our efforts, I think. Yes, sir.
I was curious, what happens to patient care when private hospitals divert patients to the poorer hospitals? Years ago, University of Chicago got in trouble because they had a program that was taking the poorer patients they didn't want because, you know, they didn't have insurance or they cost more money, and diverted them to some of the poorer hospitals. In fact, Michelle Obama, that was her job when she worked for the University of Chicago, was to put those patients to those hospitals. So what happens to the care when they go from, like, say, a private hospital to the poorer hospitals? Have they ever looked into that? Like, what's the quality or the outcome?
The behavior you're talking about on its own, which is take a patient that you don't want and send them somewhere else. I wouldn't defend that for a minute. But the question is, why do we have a situation in which there is a hospital which serves a population which isn't able to do what it needs to do? I've taken your question and flipped it on its head, said, how do we make every hospital have the capacity to treat the population on the terms that the population needs to be treated? Because we built inequities into the system, the public hospitals, publicly financed hospitals, they're struggling. They don't have the resources they need to meet needs that are being met by the richer ones. There's a duty, in my opinion, for the wealthier institutions to accept their share of the burden of care for everyone, and not to look at the size of their wallet or the color of their skin or the language they speak before they determine the kind of care they're going to be given. So I'm not arguing for anything like shunting people around. I'm arguing for raising all boats. I mean, Dr. Woodson had the chance to run a system that had the health system in the military that actually does have a basis, a population to treat, and everyone gets treated in that population. You may want to say a word about what it's like to work in that context. Do you want to comment on it?
So first of all, I want to congratulate you on an outstanding talk.
Thanks, John.
And conceptualizing a lot for us. But I did have a chance to run the military health system, which can be considered a fully insured, all-access system in which there's this peculiar thing called health and receiving health care as a condition of employment, which is even different. And in that system, we've got data that shows that many of these inequities disappear for many of the reasons that you've indicated. The social situation is different. Everybody gets paid the same. But if you look at conditions like breast cancer, which in studies from the civilian population show marked disparities, that disappears. Lung cancer, it disappears. Colon cancer, it disappears. And so there's real power in what you're saying as to how do you craft all of the government institutions to be all in on health, to get them to promote regulation and policies and programs that produce empowerment of communities and in people to reduce the inequities. We do have some evidence from an all-access system that it can be achieved.
And the underlying dynamic of the system, the military health system Dr. Woodson's talking about, is solidarity. It's like we are dependent on each other, and therefore our fate is our collective fate. The results I mean, it's not a perfect system, but I've had the privilege of watching it and working with it through the years, and it's a different, you're working with a different social contract. There's a different sense of what's going on. One example, I chaired a National Academy of Medicine committee on military trauma care, and got to look at the difference between the military trauma system and the trauma system in the civilian sector. The military trauma system is ballet. It's unbelievable. It's got some problems, but its overall achievements are astounding. And it was done cycle after cycle of promising that wounded warrior in the field with a medic on bended knee next to him is going to have the best chance of survival we can possibly produce. And that requires an engineered system, which everybody's party to it, that involves capacitation of a workforce, involves resources in a supply chain, involves transportation that you wouldn't believe, and a promise of delivery. Now you look at the civilian trauma system, which we try hard. There are some cities that are fantastic at it, but the national agenda of making that promise, we don't have it. Solidarity really matters. There's lights in my face, so I can't see who's got their hand up. Yes, sir?
First of all, great lecture. It was very good. This is probably my only question. You mentioned that other countries, they place a great amount of emphasis on socioeconomic status, inequalities that contribute to prolonging human life. And I really wanted to know, based on your opinion and based on what you know, how much of a big emphasis is the U.S. doing in terms of making sure that all of our socioeconomic status is, being looked at more in a positive way? Because I feel like everything nowadays is based on monetary values. And I don't know, maybe I'm naive in thinking this. I like to think that human life is priceless. But I don't know. I just feel like are other countries based in their value of care more on monetary values as opposed to us? I don't know. How is the system working other than ours?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I mean, first of all, the world's very complex. 190 countries. There could be 190 answers to your question. But I'd say there's a general tendency. Let's take the Western democracies, the OECD countries. So we have a lot of data on those. And what we see is I call it a different theory of investment in well-being. Whether it's related to economic thinking or not, I can't say, but we have very good research on this. Betsy Bradley, who was at Yale University, now the president of Vassar College, she did a landmark study just about a decade ago, and she said, let's not just look at healthcare expenditure and social expenditure, like on the stuff that Marmot's talking about, schools and the social safety net and so on. Let's look at the combination, the total. And she made an interesting discovery. Among Western democracies, the total amount being spent on healthcare and social services is more or less the same. It varies. In the Nordic countries, about 32% of the gross domestic of the economy. In the U.S. is 27%. There are countries at 22%, but between 20 and 30%. We're all spending about that amount. But the difference is the proportionate investment in health or determinants of health. So in Bradley's work, almost all the Western democracies, the ones with the 17 countries above us on that map of childhood well-being or longevity, they have about a 2-to-1 spending ratio. For every dollar being spent on health care, there's $2 being spent on supports I will call them supports to wellness if you'll take the social determinants thing, like housing and transportation and food supply and things like that, and social services. The U.S., it's reversed, not quite. We spend 91 cents on social supports for every dollar we spend on healthcare. We don't even look like those other countries. I think that's an underlying reflection of values and intent, and it's a decision. Where are we going to invest our resources? Back to your point about change, that's where we're locked into that right now. 18% of our GDP, that ratio, the 91 cents to a dollar, is blocked into that 18%. And when you try to move that money around, you hit a lot of screaming. You watch the politics develop. Everyone will claim disaster will happen because the hospitals don't get paid what they should get paid. So moving that money around is going to be tough. You got another choice. You could raise taxes and generate more money, not likely to work. So we're headed for a bit of a struggle if we wanted to work on social determinants.
Last question. Over here.
Hi. Thank you very much for the lecture. I am a very big fan of these kind of community-based initiatives that seek to level up the ground. My question is, I've seen it, most of the examples come from urban areas and urban redistribution. I was wondering what were your thoughts on how this would look on more rural areas where you have less access to everything, and if the same playbook can be applied, and if not, like what adequations are necessary for it.
Yeah, I grew up in a small town, very tiny town in Connecticut, a real rural town. I mean, our biggest city was Middletown, Connecticut, and I went there probably 3 times a year. How can this play in rural areas? And let me supplement your question. How does it play in low and middle income countries? What if you are Nepal or Sudan or Ghana? How are you going to deal with this? And I actually have a very favorable, almost Pollyanna view of this, because when I was head of CMS, I visited all the regions, and I remember my trip to the Pacific Northwest region, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, and at that time they were doing what they call their annual rural road trip. They actually had it was like the 60s. They had an old, I think it was a VW bus, when they stuffed the senior leaders, including me, into it, and we drove from one rural hospital to another along the coast of Oregon. You've never seen more stressed communities. Unemployment rates 25, 30%, devastated communities, very high rates of poverty and deaths of despair. But when you went to the health system there, you did not see this, I'm a hospital, all I do is surgery thing. That wasn't the way they were thinking. The hospital automatically, these rural hospitals are automatically part of their communities. They were already cognizant of and connected to the resources in the community. And I'm an optimist about the rural settings. I think that's where you may have to make the least argument for this kind of comprehensive thing, because they have no other way to go. I've worked in Ghana. We have big projects in Ghana and Malawi and South Africa. And I've been to rural clinics in Ghana, in the poorest part of the northern parts of Ghana, working on improvement. And you don't have to make the case that the community is an asset. You don't have to make the case that you better reach out to homes and meet people on their own terms. You don't have to make a case about empowerment. They're already there. And I think what we built in urban America, technocratic America, is a big shell we have to drill through to get to the heart of the matter around what matters to people, which is not a challenge in the rural areas. Whether we're willing to do, rural areas though do tend to be lower income, and that is going to raise partly the redistributional question I'm talking about. Are we willing as a nation to make sure that resources go to the most stressed areas? And that's a values question, not a technical one. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you so much, Dr.